Picture an ordinary British street in the mid-1970s. A mum nipping to the shops, kids walking home in little packs, someone hauling 2 carrier bags back from the greengrocer like it's an Olympic event. And if you look closely, Britain was slimmer. Not perfect, not model thin, but compared to now, noticeably slimmer. And here's the part most people get wrong. It wasn't a gym craze. It wasn't clean eating. And it wasn't some magical generation of disciplined superhumans. In fact, one of the biggest reasons Britain stayed slimmer back then wasn't even food. So what actually happened? How did we go from obesity being relatively uncommon to nearly 1 in 3 adults now being obese? Because this wasn't one dramatic change. It was dozens of small ones. And once you stack them together, the answer becomes hard to ignore. In the 1970s, obesity existed, but it wasn't normal. In fact, most estimates suggest adult obesity in the mid-1970s was still in the low single digits. Single digits! Fast forward to modern England, and by the early 2020s, around 29% of adults were obese. Nearly 1 in 3. Britain didn't just gain a little weight. It shifted into an entirely different reality. Back then, obesity was something you noticed. Now, it's so common it's almost become part of the background, which means the real question isn't just what did people eat? It's this: what changed so dramatically that the average British body shifted this much? Because whatever the cause was, it wasn't subtle, and it wasn't just one thing. One of the biggest differences in 1970s Britain was brutally simple. People moved more, not as exercise, not as a hobby, not as a wellness lifestyle. They moved because that was just life. In the early 1970s, a huge chunk of British households didn't even own a car. So errands weren't a quick drive, they were a walk. You walked to the shops, you walked to the bus stop, you walked home with carrier bags cutting into your fingers. And you didn't call it getting your steps in, you just called it Tuesday. But over the next few decades, car ownership became the default, so the walk disappeared. And it didn't just change adults, it changed childhood too. If you remember old school mornings, you can picture the difference instantly. Kids walking in groups, school bags bouncing, shoes scraping along the pavement. Now, a line of cars crawling past the gates, engines running, kids stepping straight from seatbelt to classroom, like they've just arrived at an airport terminal. Modern travel is smoother, faster, more convenient, but the body pays for convenience. And then there's work. If you want one quiet change that helps explain modern weight gain without even mentioning food, it's this. Britain stopped being physical. In the 1970s, a much larger share of the country worked in jobs that demanded movement. Factories, warehouses, shipyards, trades, industrial labour. Then the economy shifted. Office jobs expanded, service work expanded, computers arrived, and sitting down became the default way to earn a wage. So even if someone's diet stayed exactly the same, their daily calorie burn quietly collapsed. And once that becomes normal across an entire country, the average body has no choice but to change with it. One of the easiest things to forget about Britain in the 1970s is how regimented eating was. Not trendy, not calorie counted, not wellness, just structured. For most families, the day ran on 3 anchors: breakfast, lunch, an early evening dinner, tea or supper. And the difference wasn't always what people ate, it was when they ate, because snacking wasn't constant. Yes, people had tea and biscuits, yes, kids had sweets, but grazing all day wasn't normal. In a lot of homes, eating before dinner wasn't even encouraged, it was policed. You'll spoil your dinner. That sentence alone probably kept half of Britain slim. Now compare that to modern Britain. Today, snacking is normal, and for a lot of people, automatic. Food appears whenever you're bored, stressed, tired, watching telly, or just wandering into the kitchen for a look. So instead of breakfast to lunch to dinner, it becomes snack to coffee, to snack to meal, deal, to snack to dinner, to snack again. And after dinner eating is the biggest shift of all: crisps while watching TV, chocolate while streaming, a little something, because the kitchen never really closes. In the 1970s, once tea was done, the kitchen basically closed. No Deliveroo, no snack cupboard calling your name at midnight, no second dinner disguised as a little something. And that one change alone cuts hundreds of unnoticed calories a week. And even when people did eat indulgent food, it wasn't engineered to overwhelm you. And that's the thing. The 1970s didn't have better discipline. It had more stopping points. But once those stopping points disappeared, the food itself started changing too. And that's where the real shift begins. In the 1970s, portions were smaller across the board, not because people were dieting, because that was just what normal looked like. A cheeseburger wasn't a two-handed monster stacked with sauce, onion rings, and half a cow. It was basic, smaller. And it didn't come with a side dish big enough to feed a family of 4. But modern burgers, especially the deluxe ones, are often dramatically larger. And that's the trap, because portion inflation adds calories without changing your habits. You still feel like you're eating one burger, but that one burger is now the size of 2. And it isn't just fast food. Plates got bigger too. It sounds ridiculous, but it matters, because a bigger plate quietly changes what your brain sees as a normal serving. Drinks followed the same path. Coffee servings grew. Soft drinks grew. Everything grew. And once you start drinking calories without thinking, the whole equation changes. In modern Britain, it's completely normal to order food without leaving the sofa. You can be hungry at 8:17 and eating by 8:43. But in the 1970s, that world barely existed. The first UK McDonald's opened in 1974. And even then, it wasn't something you did on a random Tuesday night. It was a novelty. Takeaways did exist, of course. Fish and chips was the classic. But for most families, takeaways weren't a weekly habit. They were a treat. And eating out was still seen as a proper occasion. In the mid-20th century, a large chunk of households didn't eat out at all, and even into the early 1980s, eating out was still far less routine than it is today. Still a completely different world compared to now. Because today, eating out isn't an occasion, it's a habit. And modern takeaway food isn't built to satisfy you. It's built to keep you eating. Growing up in the 70s, you probably remember how repetitive the meals could be. Not glamorous, not foodie, just dependable. Breakfast might be porridge or toast, lunch might be sandwiches, dinner was the classic formula: meat and 2 vegetables. And crucially, most of it was cooked at home. Convenience food existed, but it wasn't dominant. Ready meals had started appearing in the 1970s, but they were still limited, expensive, and far from everyday staples. Cooking also took time. In the past, meal preparation often averaged close to an hour. Potatoes peeled, vegetables chopped, pans boiling. And when you've spent that long building a meal, you sit down and eat properly. But over time, that rhythm changed. Meal prep time fell sharply, from taking a long time down to something much faster. Within a couple of decades, that's a massive cultural shift, because it means dinner stopped being something you built and started being something you unwrapped. And once that became normal, ultra-processed food didn't just enter the British diet, it took it over. The 1970s weren't some pure organic fantasy. People absolutely ate tinned food. Baked beans, tinned fruit, soups, packet mixes. Frozen food was growing too. By the late 1970s, fridges were common, and many households had freezers. So suddenly you had frozen peas, fish fingers, frozen chips. And for the first time, dinner could live in a drawer. But even with all that, most of Britain was still eating meals made from ingredients. Now compare that to modern Britain. Today, ultra-processed foods make up over half of calories in the UK diet. Over half. That means the majority of the modern British diet is now made up of foods designed in factories, not cooked in kitchens. Breakfast becomes cereal bars and packaged snacks. Lunch becomes meal deals. Dinner becomes frozen lasagna or takeaway. Ultra-processed food is designed to be easy to buy, easy to store, easy to eat, and very easy to overeat.
I'd like to introduce you to Honey Monster.
Mummy.
I'm not his mummy. Now, to help a honey monster through the morning, I give him breakfast, including sugar puffs and milk.
Most people assume the 1970s were slimmer because sugar wasn't everywhere, but sugar was absolutely part of British life. In fact, consumption was still extremely high, and yet obesity was far lower. So how does that make sense? Because sugar didn't disappear, it changed shape. In the 1970s, sugar was mostly something you could see: sugar in tea, homemade cakes, biscuits, puddings, jam. It was part of rituals, tea time, dessert, a treat after dinner. Now sugar is often hidden: cereals, yogurts, drinks, processed snacks. And instead of arriving in one big obvious moment, it arrives in smaller amounts, more often across the day. In the late 1970s, food took up a much larger share of household spending. So you didn't buy mindlessly. You planned meals, you stretched ingredients, you used leftovers, treats stayed in their proper place. Eating out wasn't routine, it was an occasion. But over time, food became cheaper relative to income. And that changed everything, because once calories become affordable and high-calorie food becomes the cheapest option, restraint stops being built into the system. Today, a huge share of food spending doesn't even go on groceries, it goes on food outside the home, takeaways, chains, coffee shops, delivery. And once indulgent food becomes cheap and constantly available, it stops feeling indulgent. It becomes normal. One of the biggest differences between 1970s Britain and modern Britain is what children did with their time. In the 1970s, most primary pupils walked to school, often unaccompanied by the time they were old enough. Today, only a minority do. And that doesn't just change childhood, it changes the body. Because walking to school isn't exercise, it's built-in movement, twice a day, every weekday. Outdoor play followed the same pattern. Adults who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s reported spending hours a day outdoors. Their children in the 2000s averaged far less, roughly half, and when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. In the 1970s, there were only a few TV channels, no streaming, no smartphones, no endless indoor entertainment. So boredom turned into movement. Now, entertainment is constant, and most of it happens sitting down. And that's why childhood obesity isn't just sad, it's predictable. When people look back at the 1970s, it's easy to imagine it was some kind of healthier golden age, but it wasn't. The food wasn't perfect. People still ate sugar. They still had fried meals. They still had puddings. The difference wasn't that Britain ate clean. The difference was that Britain lived differently. Meals were structured. Snacks weren't constant. Portions were smaller. Work was more physical. Travel involved walking. Childhood was more independent. And food cost enough to stop people drifting into constant excess. So what Britain had wasn't a magic diet. It had built-in balance. Britain didn't just get bigger. Britain got easier. So here's the question. What's the one thing you remember most about food and daily life back then? Was it the set meal times, walking everywhere, or the fact that snacks were actually treated like treats? Drop it in the comments, because those little details are what tell the real story. And if this brought back memories, send it to someone who remembers that Britain too. Thanks for watching and take care.